Hello and welcome back to the Complicated Kids podcast. I'm your host, Gabrielle Nicolay, and today I'm joined by Camilo Ortiz. Thank you for being here, Camilo.
Happy to be here.
I didn't mention this before. My daughter's name is Camila.
Ah,
So I have a special affinity for your first name.
You're one of the few.
Yeah, it's unusual. Would you please tell the good folks a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Long Island University Post. We have several campuses. I'm the one that's actually on Long Island. I have a private practice where we see many anxious kids, but also kids and adults with other presenting problems. My research has traditionally been in disruptive behavior and parenting, and I have fairly recently made a switch to parenting and anxiety, which actually has a lot of overlap. Folks can follow me on Twitter if they wish, and it's Dr. like Doctor, Camilo Ortiz, and I talk about anxiety and other things.
Perfect. And that's exactly what we're going to talk about today is anxiety in kids. Part of the reason I became aware of your work was a piece you published in the New York Times, in which you had kind of an interesting take on reducing anxiety in kids. Do you want to tell us about that, or start wherever you like, actually? I mean,
yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So maybe I'll start with the lead, which is I have this new treatment that I developed for child anxiety, and it's pretty different than most other psychological and behavioral treatments in that it is, in a nutshell, what I call mega doses of independence. So typically, if you were afraid of the dark, we would bring you into the office and we would practice from really easy up, working our way up to really hard, different situations that involve the dark. Or if you were scared of spiders, we might look at a photo of a spider and eventually work our way up to handling a tarantula, something like that. And so that's called exposure therapy, and it works really well. The problem with it is that a lot of people don't want to do it. And basically, we're asking you to think of your worst nightmare and then do that over and over and over. And if you're a kid who's just had a long day of school, probably the last thing you want to do is go to a therapist's office and face your fears. And so this approach is a lot more user-friendly, I think, and in our experience so far, it has been, where we just ask kids, what are things that you'd like to do independently? And I'm sure you've noticed, and everybody I talk to has noticed, that child independence has gone down fairly dramatically over the past couple of decades. And helicopter parenting, or whatever we want to call that, has gone up. And we don't think it's a coincidence that kids are more anxious. And we think that there are a lot of protective aspects to doing independence activities that can actually be a treatment in and of itself for anxiety. And so that's what I was talking about in the Times, is this pretty simple treatment where every day we do things that are independent that kids want to do. They're not being forced to do them. And in the first study that I just submitted for publication, we saw some really nice effects on the same order as cognitive behavioral therapy and medication, and faster and cheaper than either of those two.
Okay, so what are some things that kids want to do independently? Like, what kinds of things are we talking about here?
Yeah, so the categories that we think about are indoor, outdoor, with other kids, and the one that's probably toughest for parents, which is independence activities that involve risk or danger, which we actually really like and think are important. And that can be, these days it can be climbing a tree, can be a really new thing for children. They actually track this. They ask kids in survey research, in the last 30 days, have you climbed a tree? And those numbers have plummeted over the past decade. But it can involve things like whittling with a knife. It can be starting a fire in your backyard, a controlled fire. It can be chopping vegetables and cooking a meal. It can be taking the subway or a bus by yourself to school. Risk is inherent in many things that are actually good for us.
Okay, so I'm all in on this, but I'm not the person you have to convince.
Right.
So how are you convincing parents to get over themselves? Because I can already feel all the anxiety coming at me from the
Yeah.
parents of like, my child isn't old enough, smart enough, strong enough, coordinated enough to do any of the things that you've just said. And in fact, you know, many of the parents who listen to this podcast have a child who has some kind of diagnosis that sometimes does affect their coordination or their motor system, or, you know, whatever. Be that as it may, and I think we're talking about a slightly larger group of kids here. How do you convince parents that that's an appropriate, even beneficial thing to do?
Yeah, there are a couple of answers to that, and that's a question I get asked a lot. And so one thing that we talk about is that there are risks on both sides of the equation. So there are absolutely risks if you let your child do more things independently. Those risks tend to be in the short term because as children get experience with these things, they become better at assessing and managing risk. And so you actually, in the long term, are reducing risk. So just if we take a monkey bars example, the first time you go on a monkey bar, the risk of you getting injured goes up. But the more you do it, the less the risk that involves. And in fact, it's a great activity for learning what you're capable of physically, and that can generalize to other situations. So you don't just get better at going on monkey bars, you get better at assessing and dealing with risk in general. So, you know,
This is a
one,
particularly good example because many of the kids whose parents listen to this podcast have some kind of motor or sensory involvement. And the temptation is, and then I think, again, this is a stand-in for what's happening more broadly, which is we're trying to insulate kids from their own lives. And it seems somehow more urgent, more important, more beneficial, and I put that in air quotes, if we isolate kids from things that they won't be good at, or that could, in the short term, as you say, lead them to getting hurt. Because I have plenty of kids who they don't have the grip necessary to hold on to a monkey bars. Well, how do you get a grip on some monkey bars? You
literally get a grip.
Yes, literally, how do you get a grip? You have to practice. And so I'm all in with you in terms of how do we teach kids to have skills to get good at things? They have to do them.
Yeah. And when I say this, I don't at all mean to minimize how scary this can be for parents. In our first study, we had a child who was somewhat developmentally delayed, and one of his early independence activities was to walk home from school by himself, and he had never done this. And this was so anxiety provoking for one of his parents that they had to stay home from work. They could not actually go to work. And I actually consider this the highest level of bravery, that it was this difficult and the parents still allowed it to happen. So, as a good therapist, there's going to be lots of empathy for the situation someone's in. But I do like to point out that there is a short-term risk and a long-term reduction in risk. And there's also the risk on the other side of the equation of inaction. And so we are seeing child anxiety and depression and loneliness skyrocket. And my contention is that that is at least in part due to children not being allowed to do things independently. So we are in some ways kicking the can of risk down the road, but we're going to have to deal with it anyway. Practically, in the very first session, we talk exclusively about this issue and about increasing parental motivation to allow their children to take on more risks. And I play a wonderful video directed by a filmmaker named John Papola about a woman I'm working with. Her name is Lenore Skenazy, and she became very well known about 10 or 12 years ago for letting her son take the subway by himself. And so John made a film about this, and she does a better job of explaining to parents than I ever could about why it is so important for kids to take risks. And I've had many parents actually start crying watching this film. And you can, if you link to my New York Times article, you can find it there. But
And I hesitate to even say the words, and I noticed you didn't
yeah,
either, but people are going to Google it anyway. She's the free range parenting woman.
she is.
Yeah.
She is.
And so I go watch the video, but put your judgments about that free range parenting stuff, put that in your back pocket until after you watch the video.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah, and you don't have to be a free range parent to start experimenting with increasing independence. So, you can have your child cut some vegetables and help out with dinner, and you can be right there next to them. That's not by any definition free range parenting, but it is a slight increase in independence where kids can try something slightly difficult.
Yeah.
So that film does a lot of the heavy lifting for me, in that it really makes the case that this country even is based on independence and entrepreneurial spirit, and we are suppressing that in kids.
How do you handle, so do you have parents in your practice who can't, like, in other words, this mom or parent who stayed home because they were so anxious and they could, they were sort of grinding their teeth and gripping their fists through their sons coming home. I'm sure you must have parents who are unable to do that. How does that work for you?
We've actually never had a parent who was unable to do any independence. And so we will meet them where they are.
Okay.
And if that is, 1% more difficult or more challenging or more independent than what they're used to, that's where we go. And the interesting thing is, parents and kids both recognize that this sort of epidemic of over-involved parenting is unsustainable and it's making everybody miserable. And they just need someone to tell them you're not a bad parent if you allow some more independence. And when I do that, they sort of give a big sigh of relief, and they are really ready for it. And again, it's not that it's easy, but it doesn't take a ton of convincing for most parents to know that a little independence is a good thing.
I am definitely in the business of giving parents permission slips all the time. Permission not to read books at bedtime. If your child
Yes.
doesn't like to read books at bedtime, read them at different time. Permission to not, enforce a boundary that you like immediately, that you just set. It can be 5-10 minutes. It's okay.
We literally give kids permission slips that when they're doing independence activities, they're like little ID cards that they proudly flash at meddling adults. And it says, I'm an independent kid, I'm allowed to be here. And they sign the back of it. And that's the only problem we've ever actually had with any child doing independence activities. Everybody's always worried about the stranger, doing something untoward. But the only problem we've ever had are well-meaning strangers who are like, why are you here by yourself at a grocery store? Let's call the cops or something. And so these little cards come in handy in those moments.
I love it. How old are the kids you're working with?
So the ones in my study were from age 9 to 13. Mm-hmm. And that's really where we're focusing initially, because that is when we start seeing diagnoses of anxiety disorders. Mm-hmm. But there are obvious applications for even much older kids. And so there's a parallel epidemic of failure to launch, typically young men in their early 20s. And we've even identified some independence activities that they can do. But even with as young as 2-year-olds, it's a long-standing psychological finding that even at age 2, kids want to be independent. And I remember my own daughter at age 2, her favorite line was, I can do it by myself. She would tell me, I don't need your help, even at age 2. And so there are lots of applications for little kids as well.
I think this is the hardest thing about being a parent of anybody. And as a parent of a soon to be 21-year-old and a 17-year-old who are largely typically developing and don't have anxiety or other diagnoses, but the work is on me. In other words, they are growing and changing. And if we are doing our jobs right, it has been my job to prepare them for life outside of the relationship that we have. And yet we so often lose sight of that as we're trying to protect the 3-year-old from the monkey bars, or the 9-year-old from crossing the busy street, or even the 18-year-old from getting his heart broken at school. And we forget that it's not our path to walk.
Yeah, I like two things that you said. One is the 18-year-old getting his heart broken, because sometimes we think about independence and helicopter parenting as pertaining only to physical danger. But we see this constantly protecting, again, quote unquote, kids against emotional distress. And so I talk to parents about what I call the 4 Ds, and we might think of this as their job, which is to help kids have practice and skill with the 4 Ds. And so those are discomfort, distress, disappointment, and mild danger. And kids need lots of practice with these 4 Ds, or they end up being adults who fall apart when they experience any of them because they've never had practice with them.
Or who exhibit an extreme level of control over themselves or others in order not to experience them, right? Because that kind of goes both ways.
Absolutely.
Because those
neither of those are sustainable. You cannot control the world, and you need practice with these things. So, we can talk a lot about this, but I often, as a first step, just ask parents to notice the urge to step in, and still step in. So do everything. I'm not asking you to change a single behavior. I just want you to internally, before you do it, notice the urge to step in. And once you get good at that, then we might say, well, can you step in, but in a slightly different way? This is what we call shaping. We don't expect parents to suddenly just let their kids, run into a monkey bar and get a black eye, because that's not the goal, by the way. But we have to do it in steps. And so just noticing an urge is a nice first step.
There's a there's a great scene in this mediocre movie called No Hard Feelings, which takes place on Long Island.
Okay.
Which is why I'm thinking about it doubly. There's a scene near the end of the movie. Matthew Broderick plays the dad, and there's an actress playing the wife. And then there's their failure to launch kind of 20-something son who's been highly insulated from everything. And he's trying to stack, he's got 4 suitcases, and he's trying to stack the smaller ones on top of the larger ones. And it's pitch perfect in the way that it's filmed, because you see the mom start to approach, and this is near the end of the movie, so they've all completed their journeys, blah, blah, blah. And she doesn't, but it's excruciating. And you watch him stumble, and it falls, and she tries again. And it's exactly what you're saying, which is, and it's such a tiny little microcosm that illuminates exactly what we're talking about, which is the 20-year-old needs to stack his own suitcases so that he can leave the house.
Yeah, and we really have to reframe what good parenting is. And good parenting is waiting and even letting the suitcases fall. And for some reason, we've sort of twisted this around that good parenting is preventing the 4 Ds from ever happening.
How did that happen?
Yeah, that's a question we're endlessly trying to figure out. And I don't think scientists or thinkers on this issue have really quite figured it out. But one idea is that as life has become more physically comfortable with technology, we still have this machinery up here that is created by natural selection, and its whole job is to look for danger. And so it needs to do something. And so the bar for danger keeps going down and down and down. And, it used to be getting eaten by a lion, and now it's what I heard today, which is my sibling lost a tooth and got money from the tooth fairy, and that's not fair. And so I need money from the tooth fairy. And I've heard of parents now giving every sibling money when one sibling loses a tooth. So that's what has replaced, there's a lion over there, don't go over there.
That is fascinating. I deal with a lot of kids who have their neuroception is, way off. In other words, they're perceiving threat where none exists.
Right.
Well,
it's a different kind of threat. It's a threat of discomfort as opposed to death.
Right. And no, we're not actually taught that discomfort is okay. And I don't, there are, in my experience, very few curricula
Yeah.
where that is actually explicitly taught. It's kind of like, it's something you have to get over and get through maybe, or avoid.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, we can get philosophical here, but if we didn't experience discomfort, we wouldn't know when a high is occurring in our lives. We need to compare it to something.
Yeah.
There's a show that was on a couple of years ago. I think it's called the Good Place, and where I didn't watch a lot of it, but my understanding was that everybody got everything they wanted all the time, and it turned out that it was hell.
Yes. Yes.
So you know, discomfort and all the other 4Ds actually make the rest of our lives better.
Ooh, say that again.
Discomfort, distress, disappointment, and danger make the rest of our lives better.
Just sit with that for a second.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, that really, like that, I actually experienced that physically when you said that. That is, yeah, okay. There's a lot more we could talk about, but we're going to pin it there. If people want to learn more about you and your work, what do they do?
So my website is drcamiloortiz.com, just the DR for doctor, not the whole word. They can Google me and New York Times to read that article. And if they're clinicians, it will lead them to my free treatment manual for anxious kids that they can use. And they can follow me on Twitter if they like. And it's just, again, Dr. Camilo Ortiz.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for being here. This was a treat.
It was a lot of fun to talk to you.